Beyond the Gate spoilers tease that Bill is the one pulling the strings behind Peaches and Leslie, and from the first whispers of this revelation the sense of betrayal lingers like a storm cloud over the Dupree family. What might have looked like a sequence of isolated conflicts, grudges, and unexpected inheritances begins to coalesce into a web, and at the center of that web is Bill, who has been underestimated for too long. The story doesn't open with a grand declaration of villainy but with the unsettling realization that the pieces have been arranged well before anyone in the Dupree clan thought to pay attention. Bill has been calculating, waiting, and feeding off connections until his position became unshakable, and now the shadows in which he has operated begin to reveal the larger picture of his revenge. Anita, sharp-eyed and intuitive in ways her family sometimes underestimates, sensed Bill's duplicity from the beginning. It wasn't that she could prove anything in those early days when Dany announced her intent to marry him. Rather, it was the way he smiled too quickly, the way his charm seemed rehearsed rather than lived, the way his gaze darted slightly when anyone pressed him about his past. Anita, as both mother and protector of the Dupree legacy, understood the risk of letting such a man into the fold, yet her warnings were waved away as maternal stubbornness. Dany believed she was in love, and the family, though not blind, allowed hope to win out over caution. That was their first mistake, and it opened the gate for everything that followed. Time proved Anita right. Bill's infidelity with Haley wasn't a mere lapse in judgment, it was a deliberate unraveling of his marriage. A calculated step that freed him from Dany while embedding him deeper in social circles that would one day serve his ambitions. The divorce was humiliating for Dany, but Bill wore it like armor. It gave him a new narrative to spin hat of the wronged man, misunderstood by a powerful family, driven to find his own way. People bought into it, not because it was wholly convincing but because Bill knew how to play to their sympathies, how to craft the version of himself that they needed him to be. Dany mourned, Anita fumed, and Vernon, despite his pragmatism, underestimated just how far Bill would go. That underestimation was their second mistake. Bill's network flourished through Vernon's introductions, the kind of subtle favor exchanges that wealthy families often take for granted. A recommendation here, a door opened there. And soon Bill wasn't a man defined by his connection to Dany but a man who could stand on his own. He secured contracts, courted investors, and built a reputation that made him appear indispensable. In a cruel twist, it was Vernon's own hand that sharpened the knife Bill would eventually turn back against them. Bill had patience, and that was his deadliest asset. He didn't strike in the heat of betrayal but waited until his career was untouchable, until he could move pieces on the board without anyone questioning his authority. This is where Ted's desperation folds into the larger scheme. Leslie, Ted's former lover, had been haunting the edges of his life, threatening the fragile stability he had managed to maintain. Her persistence wasn't just emotional, it had financial and reputational implications that Ted couldn't afford. In seeking Bill's assistance, Ted believed he was cutting off a nuisance, a personal entanglement that could be managed by someone who was detached and pragmatic. What Ted failed to recognize was that Bill never offered help without ensuring he received something greater in return. Aligning with Bill gave him temporary relief from Leslie's interference, but it also bound him more tightly into Bill's orchestrated narrative. The third mistake had been made, and Ted unknowingly became a pawn in Bill's revenge. The complication with Barbara's inheritance only added more weight to the storm building over the Dupree household. Leslie's sudden entitlement to Barbara's wealth was not a stroke of fortune but another strand of Bill's manipulation. He had foreseen the financial vulnerability this would create and ensured Leslie was positioned to benefit. To Vernon and Anita, this inheritance was not just about money, it was about influence, about control, about outsiders penetrating the family stronghold. They argued, searched for legal avenues, tried to unearth reasons to discredit Leslie's claim, but the reality was brutal. Bill had already fortified the walls around Leslie's newfound fortune, leaving the Duprees flailing in territory they once commanded effortlessly. The inheritance deepened the cracks within the family, and every attempt to repair them only seemed to expose how deeply Bill's influence had spread. Peaches, often dismissed as frivolous or unimportant, revealed herself to be another of Bill's well-placed assets. She wasn't acting out of loyalty to Leslie or from some personal vendetta against the Duprees. She was following a plan, one Bill had drawn with meticulous precision. Every move she made, every alliance she appeared to form, fed into the machine Bill had constructed. In return, she reaped benefits: financial stability, protection from scrutiny, opportunities that she could never have secured on her own. The genius of Bill's design was that neither Leslie nor Peaches needed to fully understand the scope of his plan. They believed they were advancing their own interests, while in truth they were paving the path for his ascendancy. As Bill tightened his hold over the financial lifelines of Vernon and, by extension, the Duprees, the true scale of his ambition became clear. This wasn't about revenge limited to Anita or retribution for a failed marriage. It was about legacy. Bill wanted to rewrite the Dupree name, to shift the spotlight until his shadow covered them completely. With Vernon's resources feeding into his ventures, he had the perfect blend of legitimacy and power. The Duprees, once untouchable, were now playing defense in a game they didn't even realize had started years before. Every attempt to reclaim control felt hollow because Bill had already anticipated their strategies. He was playing chess while they scrambled with checkers, and the inevitability of their downfall began to seep into the narrative like poison into water. The atmosphere within the Dupree family grew increasingly hostile. Anita's warnings, once dismissed, now echoed like thunder. Dany's bitterness toward her failed marriage clashed with the humiliation of admitting her mother had been right all along. Vernon, pragmatic yet prideful, wrestled with the knowledge that his own generosity had armed Bill. Ted, caught in the middle, tried to rationalize his partnership with Bill as a necessary evil, though deep down he sensed he had tethered himself to a man whose loyalty could never be bought. Every interaction carried tension. Every family gathering felt like an arena where suspicions and accusations hovered unsaid yet unmistakably present. Yet for all their awareness of Bill's looming threat, the Duprees struggled with inaction. Bill's rise was not built on brute force but on subtle maneuvers, half-truths, and careful alignments. He wasn't someone they could simply confront or discredit. His reputation in the community was strong, bolstered by the very connections Vernon had gifted him. To accuse him would risk looking paranoid, desperate, or vindictive. And so the family, though increasingly aware of his power, found themselves paralyzed, unable to strike without risking even greater damage. This paralysis was precisely what Bill counted on. The longer they hesitated, the stronger his hold became. The deeper irony lay in the way Bill understood the Duprees better than they understood themselves. He knew their pride, their hunger for respect, their obsession with image. He knew Anita's suspicions would isolate her, that Dany's heartbreak would silence her, that Vernon's pragmatism would lead him to rationalize until it was too late. He knew Ted's weaknesses, his desperation to escape scandal, and he exploited them all. Every crack in their armor had been charted, mapped, and exploited long before the family realized they were even under attack. To Bill, revenge was not about the satisfaction of a single act but about dismantling an empire brick by brick until its fall was inevitable and undeniable. The stakes now were no longer confined to inheritance battles or marital betrayals. This was about survival, and not in the literal sense, but in the sense of identity, legacy, and the family's place in society. The Dupree name had been synonymous with influence, respect, and power for generations, but Bill's machinations threatened to erase all of that. The thought that an outsider, once dismissed as unsuitable for Dany, could reshape their destiny was unbearable, yet increasingly undeniable. The whispers in the community were already shifting. Where the Duprees once commanded unquestioned admiration, murmurs of doubt began to emerge. People speculated, connected dots, wondered aloud whether the Duprees were losing their grip. And with each murmur, Bill's victory grew closer to reality. For the Duprees, the question was no longer whether Bill posed a threat, but whether they could find a way to stop him before their legacy collapsed entirely. But every path seemed fraught with danger. Direct confrontation risked exposure. Legal battles played into Bill's hands, given his preparation. Social maneuvering only highlighted their growing desperation. The stage was set for a war that could no longer be ignored, even as the family found themselves lacking a clear strategy. Bill's revenge was no longer brewing in the shadows, it was unfolding in plain sight, and the family was trapped inside a game designed for their inevitable defeat. Bill's grip on the chessboard grew so firm that even those closest to him no longer knew if they were allies or expendable pawns. Leslie, who once imagined herself free-spirited and self-directed, began to notice the invisible strings tugging at her choices. The inheritance from Barbara, which had first felt like a windfall of independence, gradually twisted into a chain of obligation. Each financial decision she made seemed already anticipated by Bill. His advice came softly, framed as opportunities, until she realized that every step she took bound her further into the architecture of his plan. Yet Leslie's pride kept her silent, unwilling to admit she had become less a benefactor of fortune and more a vessel of his manipulation. Peaches thrived on the surface, dazzled by the comfort and material gain that Bill's design afforded her. She enjoyed the appearance of agency, of being part of a grand scheme that positioned her above those who had once dismissed her. But as time passed, even she sensed the cost of being tied to a man who never truly revealed his hand. Her laughter, once careless, began to falter in private moments. She asked herself whether the wealth and attention were worth the cold calculations that underpinned them. Yet every doubt was quickly silenced by another luxury, another reassurance from Bill that she was irreplaceable. In truth, Peaches was replaceable to him, just another face in a game where loyalty mattered only as long as it produced results. Anita's fury, sharpened through years of instinctive mistrust, became both weapon and weakness. She spent nights combing through documents, questioning friends and associates, piecing together fragments of evidence that would expose Bill. The problem wasn't uncovering his manipulations, she was certain of them, it was presenting them in a way that others would believe. Her reputation for suspicion worked against her. People whispered that she was too emotional, too driven by dislike, too quick to assign blame. Bill had skillfully cultivated that perception, letting Anita appear as a woman grasping at shadows while he projected stability and success. Every outburst she made against him seemed to fortify his image, painting her as irrational while he appeared calm and wronged. This dynamic infuriated Anita, but it also deepened her resolve. She understood now that the battle was not simply about truth, it was about narrative, about who could control the story. Dany, caught in the wreckage of her marriage, drifted between anger and helplessness. The betrayal with Haley had gutted her, but what lingered most was the humiliation of being used as a stepping stone. She began to see her marriage not as a love that failed but as a trap that was always doomed. Bill had studied her, appealed to her hopes, played to her desires, and then discarded her the moment she was no longer useful. The knowledge stung worse than the affair itself. Yet beneath her despair lay a fragile seed of strength. Dany knew Bill better than anyone in the family, not because she could predict his schemes, but because she had lived in the intimacy of his deceit. She knew his rhythm, his tells, the subtle shifts in his demeanor when he was lying. What had once been the source of her heartbreak could now become the key to understanding how to dismantle him. Ted's entanglement with Bill grew increasingly precarious. What began as a desperate alliance to rid himself of Leslie's interference now looked like a tightening noose. Bill had delivered on his promise, drawing Leslie's focus elsewhere, but at the cost of Ted's independence. Every favor carried weight. Every silence demanded repayment. Ted understood, perhaps too late, that Bill had not rescued him but absorbed him. The line between ally and captive blurred, leaving Ted oscillating between gratitude and resentment. He wanted to break free, to reclaim the dignity he had traded away, but Bill had already embedded himself too deeply into his affairs. The risk of defiance was exposure, and exposure could ruin him. So Ted lingered in that liminal space, complicit yet uneasy, waiting for a moment that might never come. Vernon, pragmatic to his core, struggled most with the realization that his own generosity had armed his adversary. Bill's successes were built on introductions Vernon had offered without caution, assuming the strength of the Dupree name was unassailable. Now he saw the irony. Every door he had opened for Bill was now being used to shut the Duprees out. Vernon wrestled with his pride, torn between acknowledging his error and clinging to the hope that his influence could still eclipse Bill's rise. Yet each passing day revealed the erosion of his authority. Business partners who once deferred to him now hesitated, their loyalties swayed by Bill's growing reputation. For Vernon, the fight was no longer about wealth but about dignity, about reclaiming the respect that had been the cornerstone of his identity. What made the situation more volatile was the slow fracture of trust within the family itself. Anita's accusations against Bill often clashed with Vernon's cautious pragmatism, creating rifts that Bill could exploit. Dany's silence, born of shame, left her mother frustrated and her father uncertain of where she stood. Ted's secrets with Bill simmered dangerously close to revelation, and Leslie's inheritance added further tension. Each member of the family felt isolated, as though they were fighting separate battles, while Bill orchestrated from the shadows. It was not just the Dupree legacy at risk but the very fabric of their unity. Bill's revenge was most potent not because of the damage he inflicted externally but because of the way he turned them against each other. The turning point began when Anita uncovered inconsistencies in the way Leslie had acquired control over Barbara's inheritance. The paperwork, though legally sound, carried signatures that appeared rushed, meetings that had been arranged under curious circumstances, and advisors linked suspiciously close to Bill. Anita's instincts sharpened into clarity. Bill hadn't merely guided Leslie, he had engineered the entire transfer. Yet exposing this truth was fraught with risk. If she pressed too hard without proof, she would appear paranoid again. If she moved too slowly, Bill would fortify Leslie's position further. She turned to Dany, urging her to leverage her intimate knowledge of Bill's tactics. Dany resisted at first, unwilling to reopen wounds, but Anita's desperation eventually broke through. For the first time, mother and daughter began to move in concert, their shared pain transforming into a fragile alliance. Meanwhile, Leslie began to feel the weight of her own choices. The inheritance had promised independence, but whispers around her suggested she was little more than Bill's puppet. Friends questioned her autonomy, her loyalty, her ability to stand apart. The realization gnawed at her, planting seeds of rebellion. She started to wonder if Bill's guidance was protection or imprisonment. Peaches noticed the change, the hesitation in Leslie's voice, the dot in her eyes. Though Peaches enjoyed her gains, she also feared the consequences of Bill's wrath should Leslie drift too far. The two women, once united by opportunity, now found themselves in a quiet, unspoken conflict about how far they were willing to let Bill dictate their lives. Ted's reckoning came when Bill asked for more than he could give. What began as small favors escalated into demands that compromised Ted's integrity. Bill no longer masked his dominance, he reminded Ted of the debts owed, the secrets kept, the silence maintained. Ted felt the walls close in, realizing that his alliance was less a partnership and more a captivity. In quiet moments, he considered confessing everything to Vernon, to Anita, even to Dany, but fear silenced him. Bill had woven his control so thoroughly that Ted could not untangle himself without destroying everything he hoped to protect. And so he sank deeper, each day a reminder that survival sometimes required complicity in one's own undoing. As the months unfolded, the Duprees could no longer deny the shift in their standing. Bill's presence was everywhere, in business, in society, in the very whispers of the community. The family's once unshakable name was overshadowed by his growing empire, and every attempt to resist only seemed to strengthen his image. Anita's warnings turned into strategies, Dany's silence into cautious plotting, Vernon's pride into reluctant humility. The question was no longer whether Bill had control, but whether the family could summon the unity and courage to take it back. Bill, ever calculating, sensed the change in the air. He saw the quiet movements, the subtle defiance, the way Anita and Dany exchanged looks that suggested more than grief. He recognized the faint stirrings of rebellion and welcomed them. For Bill, revenge was never about a single strike, it was about forcing the Duprees to acknowledge their vulnerability, about watching them scramble in the ruins of their former glory. The more they resisted, the more satisfying their inevitable collapse would become. He had built his plan carefully, layer by layer, and now he stood ready to watch it bear fruit. What he didn't anticipate, however, was that the very wounds he inflicted might also become the source of the family's resolve. The storm was not yet finished. The Duprees had suffered betrayal, manipulation, and humiliation, but beneath the rubble, a fire began to kindle. Anita's determination, Dany's insight, Vernon's pragmatism, Ted's desperation, and even Leslie's wavering loyalty all carried the potential to reshape the ending. Bill believed he had accounted for every variable, but in the unpredictability of human will, cracks could form in even the strongest designs. The stage was set for a confrontation that would not simply decide wealth or influence but the very survival of a family's identity against the man who had sworn to erase it. The Duprees reached a point where silence could no longer protect them. Bill's influence had grown too vast, his shadow too long, and the family finally began to realize that their survival depended not on isolated defenses but on unity. Anita's determination no longer felt like an isolated crusade. Dany, reluctant but armed with knowledge of Bill's patterns, began to contribute her insights, piecing together fragments of his behavior that only someone who had shared his private life could understand. Vernon, humbled by the recognition of his missteps, put aside his pride and listened. Even Ted, weary from the weight of secrets, edged closer to confession. Slowly, painfully, the family began to weave together the threads of their fractured lives into something resembling a plan. What they saw was daunting. Bill had structured his empire so carefully that attacking him directly was suicide. His finances were protected, his reputation fortified, his allies carefully placed. To defeat him, the Duprees would need to shift the narrative, to expose not just his actions but his intent. Anita spearheaded this effort, drawing on her years of mistrust and her relentless drive. She argued that the only way to turn the tide was to strip Bill of the illusion of legitimacy. He thrives because people believe in him, she told them. If we break that belief, everything he built will collapse. Dany's contribution was subtler but no less critical. She remembered the small inconsistencies in Bill's lies, the way he maneuvered conversations, the tactics he used to turn sympathy into power. She guided her family on how to bait him, how to create situations where his control would falter. It was painful for her, dredging up the intimacy of betrayal, but it gave them an edge. Vernon, with his connections still intact despite the damage, began to quietly rally allies who had grown uneasy with Bill's rise. He offered them glimpses of the truth, just enough to plant seeds of doubt. Ted, meanwhile, wrestled with his own guilt, finally admitting the extent of his involvement. His confession was met with anger, but also with relief. His honesty gave them the clarity they needed to anticipate Bill's next moves. Meanwhile, Bill sensed the undercurrents. His confidence was immense, but not blind. He recognized that Anita had sharpened her suspicions into something more dangerous, that Dany's silence had given way to activity, that Vernon was no longer as passive as before. Yet Bill welcomed the challenge. For him, the true satisfaction of revenge was not in crushing passive victims but in dismantling those who dared to resist. He prepared accordingly, tightening his grip on Leslie and Peaches, ensuring their loyalties through promises and threats. Yet cracks had already begun to show. Leslie's doubts grew stronger, her resentment simmering beneath the surface. Peaches, though still enchanted by her comforts, could no longer ignore the unease in Leslie's eyes. Bill, in his arrogance, underestimated how fragile control could become once the will of his allies began to waver. The climax came not in a courtroom or a boardroom but in a confrontation engineered by Anita. She orchestrated a gathering under the guise of a family negotiation, pulling Leslie and Peaches into the room with the Duprees. Bill, confident he could bend the situation to his will, arrived prepared to dominate. But Anita had studied his rhythm, Dany had mapped his manipulations, and Vernon had lined up allies quietly watching from the sidelines. The trap was not physical but psychological. They pressed him with questions, layered and calculated, forcing him into contradictions. Dany, with calm precision, highlighted the patterns of his deceit, exposing the repetition of his tactics. Anita revealed the inconsistencies in Barbara's inheritance, documents that suggested coercion. Vernon dropped names of associates who had begun to doubt him, leveraging the power of perception. Bill tried to counter, to twist their accusations into paranoia, But the room shifted against him. Leslie, silent until that moment, broke. Her doubts spilled out in a torrent, her voice trembling as she admitted that the inheritance had never felt like hers, that every step she took was directed by Bill. Her words cracked the illusion he had built, painting him not as a self-made man but as a manipulator hiding behind others' faces. Peaches, shaken by Leslie's candor, faltered in her loyalty as well, unable to deny the truth that had been growing in front of her. Bill's mask slipped for the first time, anger breaking through the calm he so carefully curated. His outburst, sharp and venomous, only confirmed what Anita had argued all along. The fallout was swift. With Leslie's confession, Barbara's inheritance came under renewed scrutiny, unraveling the legal protections Bill had established. Vernon's allies, emboldened by the exposure, distanced themselves from him, stripping away the legitimacy that had shielded his empire. Peaches withdrew, unwilling to follow him into ruin. Ted, though scarred by his complicity, found a measure of redemption by standing publicly with his family against the man who had trapped him. Dany, her pain finally transformed into strength, looked Bill in the eye not as a victim but as someone who had reclaimed her voice. Anita, though weary, stood vindicated. Bill's downfall was not spectacular in flames but steady, inevitable, and humiliating. The power he had amassed crumbled once the illusion of integrity was gone. His revenge, years in the making, collapsed under the weight of exposure. For the Duprees, victory came at a cost: fractures within the family that would take years to heal, scars of betrayal that would never fully fade. Yet they survived, and in survival, they reclaimed their name. The storm that Bill unleashed left them altered, more cautious, less trusting, but also more united in ways they had never been before. The ending carried a bitter symmetry. Bill had sought to erase the Dupree legacy, but in attempting to destroy them, he forced them to confront their vulnerabilities, their divisions, and their pride. In surviving him, they discovered not just resilience but renewal. And though whispers of scandal lingered in society, the truth of Bill's deception became the louder story, the one that ensured his name would be remembered not as a victor but as a warning. For Anita, it was a vindication years in the making. For Dany, it was the beginning of rebuilding her life. For Vernon, a lesson in humility. For Ted, a chance at redemption. And for the Dupree family as a whole, it was the reminder that even in the face of manipulation and betrayal, unity could still rewrite the ending.